Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Essex Answers. We are very happy you watched and you enjoyed the last episode.
Dr. Lodder, and we will be talking about tattooing and art history, asking some questions related to his field of study.
We received 3 questions from our audience. So I'm going to start with the first one. How do you relate the body art to the nowadays life?
Well, if I understand that question correctly, one of the things I'm really interested in is how people misunderstand, I think, or misconceive, but tattooing particularly, but body art in general perhaps, as kind of newly fashionable, right? One of the things I collect in my research is articles from newspapers, magazines, which say that tattooing is like the new big thing, right? This new craze. Mm-hmm. I've got examples of that from every single decade for the past 130 years, right? So newspapers have been writing that tattooing's kind of the new fad since at least the 1870s, if not before. So my initial response to your question would be that tattooing now is the same as it always has been. You know, all different types of people get it. The designs, change, but really, what's interesting to me about tattooing is not why it's new, right, or not why it's now. It's why it's always. So, what I do in my research is trying to unpick the media account. So, trying to understand the differences between what the media tells us about tattoo history, or tattoo kind of current, I guess, and the reality of that I can kind of unpick from other sources. And when you do that, what you find really is that in general, there's 2 types of people. Tattooed people and not tattooed people. Or to perhaps put it more broadly, there's people who understand tattooing on some kind of implicit level and people who don't. And for the people that don't understand the desire to mark their bodies, it's always strange and always transgressive and always confusing. And most journalists come into that second category. And most academics, I have to say, who write about tattooing come into that category as well.
Do you actually see tattooing like becoming a more fashionable way of art? Or way of...
No, I think, well, okay, so what happens over the course, so I'm really interested in, and I'm really only talking about European and Western tattooing here, because the stories for non-Western is different. But in the West, it comes and goes, right? Fashionability-wise, it peaks and troughs, but it's not the case that it used to be very underground and now it's very fashionable. There are peaks and troughs. So in the 1890s it's fashionable, in the 1910s it's fashionable, in the 1920s it's fashionable, in the late 70s and early 80s it's fashionable, in the mid 90s it's fashionable, and now it's fashionable again. But it's never goes away. We're talking about kind of waxing and waning. And anyone that tells you that tattooing used to be for a certain type of person doesn't know anything about tattoo history. Because, hilariously, I found, as I collect these things, I found a great one from the 1980s which said, university lecturers are getting tattooed now. Right, 1983, 4 that was. There's articles from the 1870s. Women are getting tattooed now, right? There's journalists who write about tattooing and academics. Some academics who write about tattooing too find tattooing weird, and so they always find it surprising. And they're like, "Wow, I thought tattooing was for one type of person, but actually everyone's doing it." But that's been the story for more than a century. The realities are more complicated, but my initial response to that question is no.
Okay, I understand. Well, thank you.
I was actually wondering, is there a particular period in history where tattoos were considered like taboo? Or...
Well, I think again this sort of comes back to a similar idea, right? Tattooing is always taboo, and even when it's at its height of fashionability, it remains completely taboo because it crosses lots of boundaries. It hurts is to start with, and people normally avoid pain. It involves being touched quite intimately by a stranger. It involves bleeding in front of somebody deliberately. It involves this interesting kind of transgression of of fashion in a way, because this is the question when people say, oh, what will you think of it when you're older? Because tattooing is always of its moment and always beyond its moment because it's on your body forever. And so it annoys me a little bit when people, again, sort of journalists generally, write that tattooing is like newly fashionable because, or now, you know, so trendy it's not taboo anymore, like it's really acceptable. It's not true, because if it was true, if tattooing was totally acceptable, there wouldn't be articles about it in the newspaper every week. Right. I think fundamentally what tattooing does is, in the West again, in Western culture, is just cross boundaries, and those boundaries are immutable, right? Because they're boundaries to do with how we all perceive our own embodiment, right? And if you don't share that empathetic understanding of why people want to tattoo themselves, it's always going to be strange to you, you know. And I only tours all over the world, all over the country. I talk to loads of people. If you don't want a tattoo, I cannot convince you to get one.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, and also this is also linked to the other question that I was about to ask you. So, do you think tattoos represent an alternative way of expressing one's own feelings instead of verbal communication?
Well, yes, sometimes, but not always.
Okay.
So again, I'm quite sceptical of quite straightforward accounts of tattooing generating meaning. So one of the things, this is something that a friend of mine, a scholar called Nikki Sullivan, calls dermal diagnosis, that you can kind of understand people's intentions on their bodies. Yeah. And you find that way of thinking about tattooing in two very different places. One is in criminology and anthropology, which sort of reads tattooing in one very explicit sense as quote, the stigmata of the criminal man, right? That comes from Cesare Lombroso and Alexander La Casagna in the 19th century. And then you read it in kind of contemporary postmodernist accounts which say that tattooing is about identity expression. Those two things come from the same place, and they make some assumptions which aren't entirely true. So one of the assumptions in there is that tattooing communicates something implicitly about the self upon who it's born, only that. Yeah. That to me excludes, for example, the person tattooing it on you. It also forgets that meaning changes over time. So again, the classic example, you get a tattoo of a lover's name. It means at the time, I love that person, I want to be with them forever, I'll never forget them. If they leave you, or they cheat on you, that's a reminder never to trust anyone ever again, you know? So meanings, even in tattooing, change over time. And so these kind of very simplistic accounts of X tattoo means Y thing, or that this tattoo is communicating something about this person's identity, misses a lot of complexity. And that's what I've spent a lot of the past 10 years thinking about and writing about.
Yeah. So a tattoo changes as the person changes.
Yeah, and it changes in relation to time, it changes in relation to culture, it changes in relation to circumstance. Yeah. The other example that Nikki Sullivan writes about in her book is a guy, I don't know if this is true or apocryphal, but it's a nice story. A guy who had on his hands, on his fingers, H-A-T-E, hate, right? Mm-hmm. Very traditional tattoo. And she said when he came out of prison, kind of reformed, he told people it stood for happiness all through eternity.
Oh, that's interesting.
You know,
yeah.
so as you know, so there's no inherent immutable connection between tattooing and the person on whose body it is, because some tattoos are put on. You know, I mean, many of the tattoos I have are pieces I've collected. Yeah. They're pieces that are tattooed by artists whose work I like, and I consider them almost commodities. That I bought a piece of art from somebody. It says nothing about me, my identity in a very straightforward way. It says a lot about them as artists, perhaps, if you believe in that account of, of biographical influence on artistic production. But it's not. The relationship is much more complicated than my tattoos say something about me and only about me.
Yeah, because it might be subjective, so related to the person who actually gets the tattoo,
yeah.
or maybe what happens to that person, from the external world.
And these are very straightforward art historical questions. So when anthropologists and criminologists write about tattoos, they often miss those complexities as far as I'm concerned. I think looking at these things from an art historical perspective, and I don't want to say, and I think the question of asking whether anything, I don't just mean tattooing, but I think asking whether something is or isn't art is a really fruitless exercise. Because as soon as you draw a line, some artist will do something that crosses it. So what I want to sort of argue instead is that thinking about tattoos in the way that we as art historians think about other types of art, painting, sculpture, performance, gives us a kind of richer sense of thinking about the whole process. And these questions about like, okay, how is this image related to the person that made it, or the person that owns it, or is that a collaborative process? These are very straightforward questions which art historians have thought a lot about in relation to other forms of art making, and they map very nicely, as far as I'm concerned, onto thinking about tattoos.
I see. Interesting. Nice.
Well, that's a very interesting topic, and now
Thank you.
Yeah, it is actually, because many people are like having different ideas nowadays. Like some of them are pro, some of them are against.
Always has been, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So now I was also thinking about the third question, which is like, what is the first thing that comes into your mind when you plan having a new tattoo?
At the moment, where have I got space for one? I got tattooed on Friday. So 2 days ago, over the weekend, and literally I've got a weird gap here.
Yeah.
I had a weird gap here, and I was walking around. I was at a tattoo convention, and some tattooists had a little sheet of gap fillers, and literally it was like, there's a gap, fill it in. So it was really no more considered than that. And I think actually, funny enough, the first tattoo is hard. The last tattoo is easy, right? Like the first tattoo, that kind of crossing of the Rubicon of like going from untattooed to tattooed, at least for me and for lots of people I know, not for everybody, but for me certainly, it was a big deal. I'd thought about it a long time. I thought about what I wanted. I thought about how I wanted to do it. I didn't want to get tattooed by some random guy. I was, and now it's literally like, oh, I like your work. Where have I got space?
Yeah.
Right? And a lot of my recent tattoos, I like only as images. And in fact, some of them I dislike as images, actually, weirdly. But I think that, I think the art that I dislike is also interesting. So, and you'll find this with most heavily tattooed people. The first one or two will be big decisions and difficult and complicated and thoughtful. And, when you've got lots, having another one is such a minor thing in lots of ways. And I don't want to be universalist about this, but, when you become a tattoo collector, at least, it is just a case of, do I like your work and where would it fit on my body?
But is there a connection between the tattoo itself and the place you design on your body? Well,
there's certainly an aesthetic. I mean, I'm not just slapping things on randomly. There's certainly some aesthetic sensibility. And, for example, this piece on my throat, for example, here, is put there to work specifically with, with my anatomy. It's not just randomly slapped on anywhere. So there is a kind of there is a connection of placement, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, especially when you've kind of, again, like I have, and a lot of people who are quite heavily tattooed, who filled up a lot of their obvious spaces. Like both my arms are completely full, my chest is full. You do find lots of people actually end up, again, not true for everybody, but lots of people end up with using their legs for collector pieces, because like lots of people don't get their first tattoos on their legs for whatever reason, and your legs end up being placed where you have gaps left. So when you want to get tattooed, you end up with just a nice spot on the leg. So yeah, we're not just slapping things on randomly, but I think the idea that one is intimately and intricately connected, to another is not necessarily true. And again, I'm just talking about Western tattooing, because there are in various non-Western tattoo traditions very important links between placement and iconography, but that's not really true in Western tattooing.
Yeah, I know, because I was actually, I used to watch a TV show, maybe you know her, Kate Fundi.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she's amazing, and I've seen like many people who were going there to design their tattoo. She was asking, where do you actually want this tattoo to be drawn?
Yeah, real tattooing's not like that. That's TV.
Okay.
So that doesn't really happen for most tattooed clients. So, and I've written a little bit about this. I think like a lot of this idea that tattoos and meaning are linked, and we've talked a bit about that already, is because people who aren't tattooed ask people what their tattoos mean, and they assume a meaning, and then people feel compelled to kind of constrain a meaning on top of it. Now that's not to say all tattoos are meaningless all the time, and certainly it's possible to build narrative tattoos. I've got like no more on my knuckles, and that's obviously because I'm an academic, right? There's a link there to my life. So I'm not saying this is totally separate, but most tattooists don't care why you're getting tattooed. I mean that quite seriously. Like, most tattooists want to know what you want to get, and they're not so interested in the reasons. Particularly because they have their own subjectivity, because they're artists themselves, and they have their own kind of artistic input into the pieces. So I've got tattoos. If you ask me what they mean, I'm like, go and talk to the person that did it. I just own the thing. It'd be like Cosimo Medici trying to tell you, what a Leonardo da Vinci painting means. There's a kind of distinction between the owner and the artist. I think about tattooing as a collaboration, actually, in lots of ways, between the bearer and the tattooer, but it is a collaboration, and it can never be anything other than that. You can't completely separate the tattooer and the tattooee from each other. So there's always going to be two subjectivities in play.
Oh, okay.
Right. So I think, that's not to say that the whole process of getting tattooed that you see on television is entirely separate from how it really happens, but a lot of that kind of dramatic narrativization is televisual more than anything else.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense? I think it's interesting. It's interesting again to kind of illustrate that point. So you go on if you ever go into a tattoo shop or even look on a tattooist's website, you will see nothing. Literally nothing, less than nothing, about the people who are tattooed. It's just pictures of the work. Tattooists think of their tattoo as their own work most of the time, and they don't really kind of want to absorb the symbologies or the narratives from their clients because they're bringing their own subjectivities to the table.
Yeah, I'm saying this because I'm struggling of what you're saying, that this is something that comes from the inside of the person.
Well, no, I think it's not just from the inside. It's a mediation between inside and outside.
Oh, okay.
Right. It's always the inside and the outside mixing together.
Oh.
And I think trying to think about it in just one of those ways, either just as inside or just as outside, misses this complexity of the interrelationship between the client and the tattooer. So that's a kind of common understanding, I think, that tattooing works in one direction. Either it's culture inscribing itself on the body, or it's the body or the self inscribing itself on the body. But actually what's going on is both of those things at the same time, and they're mediated through the image, but it's always bidirectional. So just as a kind of illustrative example, there's a tattoo artist called Spider Webb, who was a kind of conceptual tattooer in New York in the 80s. And he used to go to colleges and do talks and say, who wants a tattoo? And like hands go up all over the room. He'd say, right, green, colour your nose in green? And they'd be like, oh no, I don't want that. So at the end of the day, the tattooist can do whatever he wants to, people do go in and say, do whatever you want, but the client can always get up and walk away. At the same time, the client can come in and demand a very, very accurate, precise representation of something they've drawn, or be very, very exacting. But how hard that tattooist presses his foot down or her foot down will affect what that tattoo looks like. And it, like any other form of art making, it will be changed by the skills and experience of the person doing it. So you can push it so far, which is the do whatever you want approach, or you can push it so far the other way, which is please copy this design exactly. But even at the very extreme edges, there's collaboration, and most tattoos happen somewhere in the middle of those two things. Really, that's what I want to kind of talk about, is how tattooists and clients work together, really, in a lot of ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I see what you're saying. Well, I think we've just found out like many things about tattoos, and I believe that my colleague Graziana has some personal question about the art history, meaning of tattoos, and how this actually implying into a career.
Yes, because first of all, we can think of a tattoo as a form of art, where basically our body is our canvas. So in this, like, we can think of a painter who is trying to think of some new ideas of, in order to paint a new a new landscape, a new a new object, whatever it comes to his or her own mind. But I think that seeing from the tattoo perspective, I think that it becomes not just a matter of, oh, I don't know what to paint on this canvas. It's just something like more subjective, more related to like, what do we actually think and how do we want to express this feeling, this particular time of our lives. So I'm really, really impressed, and I really found out a lot of things that I honestly didn't know. So speaking of art, can the versatility of a degree in art history be useful when thinking of a job career after graduation?
That's a good question. So I came to art history as a set of methods, right? A way of thinking about the world. So I didn't really train as an art historian as an undergraduate. I didn't really go to art galleries as a kid. I don't come from a family who are very artistically minded, let's put it that way. And so when I discovered art history as a way of thinking, rather than as a kind of object set, rather than as a set of canons, it really kind of blew my mind in a way, because here all of a sudden was a careful, systematic, well thought, deeply researched, intricate set of approaches, basically, to thinking about the world we live in. Because ultimately, right, our eyes are our richest sense. We think about and experience the world primarily through our visual, our visual senses, and everything around us has been made with some kind of aesthetic in mind, basically, from our clothing to our bodies to our buildings to the pictures on the walls to the cups we use. And so, as far as I'm concerned, right, there's no more profound way of approaching, the kind of approaching the world. If you understand why things look the way they do, how they've come to be that, how those things have changed over time, and what those things mean, and how they affect us as individuals, you understand very fundamentally how the world works. And that, that is a useful set of skills, not just if you want to kind of be a gallery curator or work in an auction house, or even deal with images on a day-to-day basis, like if you want to work in advertising or in the media or something. What it does do, it gives you a skill of thinking about the world you live in a different way. And any career, plenty of careers, most careers value people, students, young people with those skills, who can think about the world they live in critically, carefully, systematically. Something like 70% of graduate jobs don't require a specific subject. If you do want to be a heart surgeon, don't do art history. Yeah. But just generally, what employers want are, as far as I can tell, and I had a real job before I became an academic. I worked as a translator. What employers value, I think, and what human beings value in other human beings actually is a open-minded, thoughtful, considered sense of your own place in the world, right? And how your actions impact on other people's actions. And that's what history is about, really. It's about relationships between people, minds, bodies, selves, and the worlds we live in, the objects and buildings and things around us. I think what history does, it builds visually, it builds students with visual acuity, so you can think about how you exist in the world, but you can also, you also think about, it also promotes empathy, because to understand art you have to understand other people, and why things have been made the way they've been made, and what they're trying to communicate, and how what they're communicating changes how you feel about the world. And like, what's better than that, to create wonderfully interesting, wise and empathetic human beings, right? That's, I mean, and it's not just art history that does that, but plenty of other ways of approaching the world achieve the same thing. But I think it's a real pleasure and a real, it's a real delight, as well as I'm saying, to be able to kind of help my students engage with the world it kind of it turns up the contrast a little bit, makes the world they live in a bit clearer. Because learning about art is learning about human beings, right?
Yeah. And also I think that as well as the title that someone is awarded when he or she graduates, I think that one of the main things are the skills that
absolutely.
That are developed throughout the university period of study.
Yeah.
And then how those skills are actually put into practice when it comes to.
Absolutely. So there are very obvious art world careers. I've mentioned some already. Working in galleries, working in museums. There are slightly more random ones, but ones that are connected in sort of fairly obvious ways, like advertising.
Yeah.
Or the media, fashion. But there are also things like PR or education, or even kind of finance or therapy or counselling, or things that require you to kind of engage with the world, understand how other people work and why other people behave the way they do. It's all degrees, right? All education. I really hate instrumentalization of education, because education's more than a path to earn more money. It's that, but it has to be more than that. It's about learning to be a better person.
Yeah.
Right. And I think artists of all kinds are wrestling with that question of what does it mean to be a human being in this universe. And I think if you understand that, it helps you reflect on your own humanity, and that can only be a good thing. If more people understood themselves, I think the world would be a better place. And if they understood other people, the world would be a better place. And this is what art's about. It's about understanding the perspectives of others, and how your perspective of yourself intersects with those, with other people.
Okay.
Right.
Good. Thank you.
I think
that's all for today.
Yeah, and I think we've got a very interesting topic today, and I really think that you guys liked it. And don't forget to subscribe and watch this episode. And also, we are waiting for your questions in order to start shooting the next episode. Thank you very much to Dr. Matt Lodder for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
And have a nice day.